Well, it's good to be together today. This is kind of a holiday weekend, and we may, in fact, have some visitors with us. We're certainly grateful for your presence, and it's a great thing that we can come together and worship together. I've got some of my family with us this morning, Doug and Katie and their children, and we're certainly glad to have them visiting with us. In recent weeks, I have looked with you at a couple of the sayings of Jesus, the I am sayings. One of those is in John chapter 6, where Jesus says that he is the bread of life. And then last time, we looked at John chapter 8, verse 12, where Jesus says, I am the light of the world. And these messages that Jesus preached were certainly magnificent. They were mighty. They were majestic, accentuated by the fact that in the case of John 6, he had just fed 5,000 people. In the case of John chapter 8, we looked at this tradition that the Jews had during the Feast of Booths to light these giant candelabras at night, and that would symbolize the pillar of fire by which God had led them in the wilderness. And so you can just absorb the saying that Jesus is making here, not just that there is light, not just that I can point you to the light, but I am the light of the world. And then really he goes on to John 9, we did not look at this, where he restores the sight of a man born blind. And so truly for that man, he was the light of the world, not only physically, but also spiritually. And so in chapter 10, we have another I am saying. I am the good shepherd, Jesus says. He's using an image that was familiar to people of that time, not so familiar to us. We know what a shepherd is. But my guess is that most of us are not around sheep and shepherds as those people would have been. But we certainly recognize that there are many passages which talk about this. Probably the most familiar, Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Those were meaningful words to those people, but we understand the image that's being used, as much as if today someone would talk about driving a car or using a cell phone. Those are common images for us. Another place is Exodus 34, which is helpful in understanding the role of a shepherd. Ezekiel actually speaks to the people in captivity, and he indicts the shepherds of Israel, the prophets and the priests who had really not done what they were supposed to. But listen to his words as he expresses them. Verse 34 in chapter 34, verse 1, the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel, prophesy and say to them, even to the shepherds, thus says the Lord God, ah, shepherds of Israel, who have been feeding yourselves. They weren't feeding the sheep. They were feeding themselves. Should not shepherds feed the sheep? You eat the fat, you clothe yourselves with the wool, you slaughter the fat ones, but you do not feed the sheep. The weak you have not strengthened, the sick you have not healed, the injured you have not bound up, the strayed you have not brought back, the lost you have not sought. And with force and harshness you have ruled them. And so he says, verse 5, so they were scattered because there was no shepherd. And they became food for all the wild beasts. My sheep were scattered. They wandered over all the mountains and on every high hill. My sheep were scattered over all the face of the earth with none to search or seek for them. They really hadn't done their job, had they? And so in verse 15, as the Lord continues, he says, I myself will be the shepherd of my sheep, and I myself will make them lie down, declares the Lord God. And then finally he says in verses 23 and 24, I will set up over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he shall feed them. He shall feed them and be their shepherd, and I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David shall be prince among them. I am the Lord, I have spoken. So ultimately, there will be a shepherd that God will send. We understand it was not literally David, it was Jesus himself who came as the Messiah. And so that passage ties to this one at which we're looking, John chapter 10. And I want you to notice that at the end of this first few verses in chapter 10 at verse 6, John tells us that this figure of speech Jesus used with him. He was speaking figuratively in order to teach his message in a way that those people could understand the message that he was trying to convey. That term figure of speech is translated in some translations parable, not the same word usually used for parable, but very similar to it. And the New King James Version says this illustration Jesus used. It's the word translated proverb over in 2 Peter 2 when Peter says it's like the proverb about the dog that returns to his vomit or the sow that goes and wallows in the mire. And it is the idea of a short narrative that has a symbolic meaning. So let's look at this short narrative. And I want you to notice in the first couple of verses, we've got three different figures that Jesus uses. Verse 1, truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs in by another way, that man is a thief and a robber. And then verse 2, but he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. So those three figures are used in this passage, and I'd like to look with you at them. And of course, the one most prominent is that one of a shepherd. Jesus says, as we read in verse 11, I am the good shepherd. Well, a sheepfold is a place where out in the wilderness, where the shepherd is taking the sheep, he goes at night in order to bring them together and to protect them after they've been pasturing during the day. And so here are some photos of some sheepfolds. This one shows some kind of brush that they use to surround the sheep, and that seems to work fine. And then this one in Turkey is probably more the traditional kind of gate or fence that we might use. I don't know if you can make that out. And then we've got a similar sort of thing, another picture from Turkey. This is a picture that Farrell had on his website. And these are stones that are used to surround this sheepfold in which the sheep would be gathered together as the shepherd takes care of them. And then here's one in Israel, and this one's actually kind of built into the land, the side of the hill there. You can see the rock covering it, but the rock's built up around it, but you see that door there on the left-hand side. And so this idea of the shepherd entering by the door, and the thief and the robber might try to come in by some other means. And then finally, here is one from actually the island of Crete, but it shows all three of those things together. Here is the shepherd who is herding his sheep, and you see the door there through which he herds them, and so they are safe together in that sheepfold. And so those photos maybe help us to understand the images that those people would have readily understood. And so back to verse 1, Jesus says, I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs in another way, that man is a thief and a robber. This matter of a sheepfold is a place of security for the sheep. It is where they are taken at night, where intruders can't get to them. And so the thief and the robber is going to try to enter in some other way. Some have said that the door of which Jesus speaks here in verse 1 is that door of prophecy by which the true shepherd enters. Now, I don't know if that's Jesus' intention here. I will say that it is certainly true that one of the ways by which people could have known Jesus was that he came according to prophecy. Why the gospel writers are constantly quoting prophecy that Jesus has fulfilled, some of which Jesus uses himself. And so he makes it apparent that he has come from his Father according to prophecy, and that others can recognize him in that way. Now, sadly, despite that prophecy, there were those who didn't recognize him because they had their own ideas of what that shepherd was supposed to be. And so he enters by the door and he calls for his sheep. Verse 3, to him the gatekeeper opens, the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought them out, all his own, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. So take into account all that Jesus is saying here. He says that the gatekeeper recognizes the shepherd who comes for the sheep. And so those sheep will go with that shepherd because they know him and he knows them. And he calls the sheep by name and they go with him. And he leads them out into the pasture. So there's both that sense in which they are secure in this sheepfold into which they've been able to enter, but then the shepherd will take them out for the sustenance that they need day by day. And that's the kind of shepherd that Jesus is. He indeed knows his sheep by name. He knows each one of us who are his sheep. There's no doubt or confusion in his name. Sometimes we try to remember names of folks that we've met, and it might be a little bit difficult to do, or maybe it's been a period of time since we knew their name, and we've got to familiarize ourselves again with them. Jesus knows our name, and he knows who his sheep are. And those sheep will follow him because they know his voice. And then verse 5, a stranger they will not follow, but they will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers. It's interesting, if you look on YouTube and Google this, you can find some examples. I found one of a shepherd calling to sheep, or different shepherds calling, they didn't respond, and then their shepherd called to them, and they perked up their ears and they came. That's the image that Jesus is using, one that was familiar to all of these people. And really, if you go back to that example in chapter 9 of Jesus healing the blind man, even that occasion conveys this idea of listening to Jesus. Here was a man who couldn't see, and yet Jesus speaks to him, and he obeys what Jesus says to do, and he's given his eyesight, and he follows after Jesus, even though the authorities later cast him out of the synagogue because he's willing to stand up for Jesus. And so here is a sheep who is willing to follow this shepherd that leads him. Now, thinking about all those things, let's just ask ourselves the question, whose voice do I listen to? Because there are just an array of voices out there, aren't there? I mean, you can go a number of different places, and these days, by way of social media, you can go on YouTube, and you can just, the voices are unlimited. Or you can go to the podcast and listen to people who are leading in a sense. They're giving information, and the question is, who are we going to follow? And really, ultimately, that decision comes down to, am I going to listen to Jesus as the shepherd, or am I going to listen really to my own voice? What am I going to do? What choice am I going to make? It's real easy for us to feel, well, at least at times, like we know what we need to know, we know what we need to do, and we're pretty confident in ourselves. And we might treat Jesus as a shepherd more like a consultant. Well, if I need you, I'll call on you. And of course, that's not what Jesus is talking about here, is he? Sheep are not like other animals who can survive in the wild. Sheep can't do that. They're defenseless. And they're helpless, and they need this shepherd. And Jesus uses that image, like the prophets did, to convey who it is that we are. We need to listen to the voice of Jesus. We need to do so comprehensively. By that I mean, in every area of our lives, whatever that area might be. It's not a matter of just segmenting things, and so here's where Jesus tells me some things I ought to do, but otherwise I'm on my own. Think about those different areas: politically, socially, sexually, professionally, financially, our family, our recreation. even our own thoughts. Whose voice are we listening to? Now, when I say that, let me make it clear. I'm not talking about some voice in our heads that's kind of speaking to us and we can hear some voice guiding us. People often refer to that sort of thing. We're talking about Jesus and his teaching, and he delivered his teaching through the Holy Spirit to his apostles. His apostles preached that word. They wrote it down. It has been transmitted to us in his word. We're talking about following what the scriptures teach us. And by doing that, we can have a relationship that is personal with Jesus. We are following him. We are listening to his voice. So it must be comprehensive. Will I do all that he says to do in all these different areas? And then I would suggest it's also existential. We hear that word a lot today, don't we? We hear it in reference to climate change. Why? Climate change is an existential threat, meaning our very existence is being threatened by that. Let me suggest for us that the real existential threat is us doing Jesus' will, following him as a shepherd. And what that means is that, yes, moment by moment, my steps are being guided by Jesus as the shepherd who tells me how I should live and what I must do. And I must rely upon him for all that I need and for all that I need to do. Well, let's look at that second image that he mentioned, starting at verse 7. He's mentioned it in verses 1 and 2. So Jesus again said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep." And so he says in verse 8, "All who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them." So as he had said previously, they'll flee from the strangers. The thieves and the robbers are coming to try and steal away the sheep. And I would suggest there are thieves and robbers today. Back then, I suppose there were those, even before Jesus and certainly after, who claimed to be messiahs. And they were trying to lead the sheep away. But there are those voices today that would lead us into other pastures and ones that are not productive as far as God is concerned. He says in verse 9, verse 8, "All who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them." Verse 10, "The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy." So here are those trying to take from what God has given. On the other hand, Jesus says, "I am the door through which to enter." So yes, he is that sheepfold into which we go, but he's also the door through which we enter. And notice what is said about him as that door. "I am the door," verse 9, "if anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and will find pasture." Jesus is the one upon whom we can rely. And then he says in verse 10, "I came that they may have life and have it abundantly." Jesus, as our shepherd, wants to give us life. Now, what kind of life are we talking about there? You know, there are many today who are preaching kind of a health and wealth gospel. And if you really want to enjoy life, you've got to have all that life can give you, whether it be material possessions or other kinds of blessings. And that's what we're to be seeking. And that's what we're to expect in terms of what Jesus is promising. That's simply not the case. Jesus promises sometimes hardship because we follow him. There may be others that oppose us because they hate him for who he is, and they will hate us for who we are. But that should not deter us from this life that Jesus has to give. So what is that life that he provides? Well, for a sheep going out into the pasture, it would be that pasture and that still water beside which he leads us. For us, it is life. But what kind of life? Well, it's more than just eating and sleeping, isn't it? Someone has said life is more than endlessly conjugating the verb to eat. You know, we're just concerned all the time about what we're going to eat or what we're going to do or what we're going to enjoy. That's not the kind of life that Jesus promises here. He is promising us life according to the kind of being that we are. Yes, we have physical existence. He gives us that, but there's more to it. We have minds with which we can think, and Jesus gives us truth by which we can know what to think and what to do. We have emotions. We have a will. And Jesus, through his teaching and through his leading, provides a relationship for us with him and with others. Relationships that are fulfilling and through which we can find the things that we desire. Well, finally, the third example that he uses, the third image, is that of this good shepherd. And so consider what he says about the good shepherd. Verse 11, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. We'll come back to that one in a moment. That's the degree to which this shepherd is committed to the sheep. Now, he contrasts that in verse 12 with the hired hand. And so this is somebody different from that thief or robber. But here's the hired hand. What does he do? He's not a shepherd. He does not own the sheep. He sees the wolf coming and he runs. He leaves the sheep and flees. And the wolf snatches them and scatters them. And then we're told in verse 13, he flees because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. There's one of the major differences between the good shepherd and the others. He's someone who truly cares for those who are sheep. Now, with that image in mind, think about David, the young shepherd boy who goes to the battlefront where his brothers are fighting, and Goliath has brought the Philistines out, and they're lined up against the Israelites. And David sees what is happening, and he makes an appeal. He says, I'll go out and fight Goliath. Now, Saul should have been the one fighting, but Saul was kind of hiding back behind his own lines. And so when David makes his appeal to Saul in 1 Samuel 17, verse 33, he says, Saul says, you're not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you're but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth. He's been fighting ever since he was young. This is a mismatch, Saul says. Listen to David's response. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Now you get a little better idea what that shepherd's doing out in the wild there. Here comes this wild animal, this bear or this lion, and he takes one of those sheep. David says, I'll go up there and I'll fight for him. I'll get him. I'll rescue him. I'll take him back, rather than just leave the bear or the lion to do what he will. He says, verse 36, your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. Now, you might think, well, David's just kind of bragging on himself here. He's just talking about his own exploits. Verse 37, David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine. David's not saying, I did this by myself. I did this with the Lord's help. That's what's required of a shepherd, a true shepherd, one who cares for the sheep. And that's the kind of shepherd that Jesus is. Look at verse 14 and 15. Jesus repeats, I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. And then he says again, I lay down my life for the sheep. Jesus is a good shepherd, as we said earlier. The sheep listen to his voice. He knows his sheep. He knows them by name. He knows me. He knows everything I've done. There's no way of hiding what I've done from the shepherd. He knows my good points and he knows my bad points. And despite all of that, he still loves me. And he is willing to lay down his life for me. And so he has given himself sacrificially, giving his own life in order that we might have life. His is a pure and a selfless love, a self-sacrificing love. What does he gain out of this? Yes, there is this relationship that he has, but he is willing to give himself in order that we might have life. And then finally in verse 16, I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock, one shepherd. So Jesus says, I have other sheep. And he's thinking here, I think, of beyond the Jews, his people, to whom he had come. He has others that he seeks to draw to himself, that he seeks to send his voice out so that they will listen and so that they will respond. And of course, he's thinking of Gentiles in addition to Jews. They're not of this fold, but they will listen to my voice. And as a result, there will be one flock and one shepherd. There aren't different groups. There's not some sort of status in terms of who is really a true sheep. Jesus offers that opportunity to anyone who is willing to follow him. Verses 17 and 18, for this reason, the Father loves me because I lay down my life that I may take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up again. This charge I have received from my Father. Sometimes people will argue about who really was responsible for the death of Jesus. Was it the Jews or was it the Romans that we're to indict as far as who really had Jesus put to death? Well, my answer would be you're both wrong. Jesus didn't have somebody take his life. Jesus laid down his own life. And he says, I can take it up again. And indeed, that's exactly what happened when his life was taken from him. He was raised from the dead 3 days later. And so the question is, well, what are we going to do about this? On this occasion, here is Jesus who has done these signs and miracles. Surely everyone is going to believe that he's the one. He's the Messiah. He has come through the door of prophecy. He is the shepherd that's here to lead us. But if you read on in verses 19 and 21, there was division among the people. Some said, he's got a demon, he's insane. And others said, how could he be insane? He was able to restore the sight of a blind man. The reason is because each one had their own idea of what they thought the Messiah was supposed to be. Jesus came from his Father. He was the kind of Messiah that God had always intended. And so our question as we close this morning is, what kind of Messiah are you looking for? What kind of shepherd do you desire? One to whose voice you will listen, one who has given up his life for us so that we may have life, one who promises this abundant life that only he can give. Jesus is in fact that good shepherd. In fact, I would close with this thought. Look back to Psalm 23 and think of Jesus as being that shepherd. I don't think we're doing an injustice to the psalm to substitute him there. Jesus is my shepherd, I shall not want. Jesus makes me to lie down in green pastures. Jesus leads me beside still waters. Jesus restores my soul. Jesus leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for Jesus is with me. His rod and his staff, they comfort me. Jesus prepares a table before me in the presence of my enemies. He anoints my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the mansions that Jesus has prepared for me forever. Is that your desire today, to have Jesus as your shepherd? If you are not one of his sheep, you may become one by listening to his voice and doing what he teaches, and becoming one of his children, his sheep, by being baptized into him for the forgiveness of your sins. If that's your desire, we can have that blessed assurance. Won't you come as together we stand and sing this song of invitation?